you are very welcome to this online event, Levelling Up After COVID, the Value of Social Infrastructure, being hosted by the Bennett Institute for Public Policy here at the University of Cambridge. My name is Diane Coyle. I'm your chair for this evening. This is an event that touches on a lot of our research at the Bennett Institute. And in a month or so, we will be issuing a report by my colleagues, Professor Michael Kenny and Tom Kelsey, on social infrastructure. But this evening, we're absolutely delighted to host three leading experts from academia, government, and civil society to discuss the value of social infrastructure in building cohesive and economically vibrant communities, and looking at the landscape after the pandemic. So the housekeeping first. The event's being recorded, but attendees can't be seen or heard. And the recording will be on our website and our YouTube channel soon. Later on, there's going to be an opportunity for you to put questions to our guests. And to do so, please use the Q&A function. And the team, the organizing team, is going to make sure that I see all the questions, and we'll put them for you. If it's relevant, tell us who you are or where you're from. If it's for a specific person, please say so. Please do feel free to tweet, and the hashtags and the Twitter handles of our participants will pop up in the chat, so you can find them there. So I'm going to start introducing our participants now. So if I can ask them to turn on their cameras when they get the message from Rebecca behind the scenes. We've got three fantastic guest speakers. I'm very excited about this event. We have got Professor Eric Klinenberg, very distinguished US sociologist, whose work I first came across back in 2002 with a book called Heat Wave. And his most recent book, Palaces for the People, focuses on social infrastructure. We have Dame Julia Unwin, who has extensive senior leadership experience in the voluntary sector and chaired the inquiry into the future of civil society. And we have Stephen Aldridge, who's chief analyst at MHCLG, which for the non-UK participants is the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government here in the UK. And he's got vast experience across Whitehall and great wisdom in all the years I've known him in thinking about the possibilities and the limits of what government can do. That's the lineup, and I don't think it could be a better lineup for this particular subject. So the plan is that I will give each speaker an opportunity to speak for 3 or 4 minutes in turn, and then I will have a bit of a conversation with them. And then in the final part, we will turn to the audience and your questions. But do feel free, please, to put questions into the Q&A as soon as you are ready to. So let me turn first to you, Eric. Your book is about social infrastructure and specifically the role that libraries play. So can you tell us a bit about your thinking on the importance of social infrastructure?
I can, yeah. And first, let me say thank you for inviting me to be here with you today. I'm very sorry I can't be in Cambridge. Like everyone else, I'm pretty much stuck at home. I'm speaking to you now from Manhattan, which is better than it was a year ago, but still not in terrific shape. It's hard to believe it's March, isn't it? It's 1 year to the month that we were told by the World Health Organization and other health agencies that it was time for us to get socially distant. We needed social distancing to survive the pandemic. Do you remember that early message that we had in the absence of masks or a clear idea about what we could do to protect ourselves and each other? We were told that we needed to hunker down and keep away from each other. And when I heard that idea come from the World Health Organization, I understood what they were getting at and why they were encouraging us to distance. But I also knew right away that the message was a horrible one, because the truth is it's not social distance that protects us during a pandemic. It's physical distance that protects us in a pandemic, right? It's physical distance that puts us at risk or makes us vulnerable. If we are physically close, when we cough or sneeze or talk too loudly or sing, we run the risk of infecting each other. But it's also incredibly dangerous for us to be socially distant, because if we're socially distant, it means we're taking care of ourselves and turning our back on society. And what we've learned in the past year, once again, is that in crises and in ordinary times too, our relationships to each other are really the things that make the difference between life or death. And so I've been thinking a lot about how we get physical distance, but social solidarity in a pandemic. And then also how we rebuild some sense of collective purpose and solidarity coming out of it. And it's for that reason that I'm so pleased that you've organized this symposium around social infrastructure. So I want to be a little more specific about what I mean by social infrastructure. I wrote this book a couple of years ago. In England, it's called Palaces for the People, How to Build a Better and More Equal Society. And the idea in this book is there's a thing called social infrastructure that is just as real as the infrastructure that we have for transit or for water or for electricity. We just don't have a concept for it that we use as often or as robustly. And so it's hard for us to see it. And when I say social infrastructure, I'm being quite specific. I mean the physical places and the organizations that have a physical plant, but the physical places that shape our capacity to interact with each other. So I'm not referring to, the health sector, the education sector, these things that are sometimes described as social infrastructure in Europe. I have a more place-centric view, social infrastructure, physical places. And my argument in the book is that when we invest in these places, when we design them well, when we build them well, when we maintain them, and maintenance is actually very important because places like England and the United States once built a lot of social infrastructure that we've let rot and fall apart. In England, when I was there, there's a lot of concern about the selling off of libraries because of austerity. So when we maintain social infrastructure and when we program social infrastructure, we get all kinds of returns to our public life. But when we neglect it, when we fail to recognize how much we rely on social infrastructure to build some sense of common purpose or civil society, to build the kind of solidarity that we will need to get through the rest of the pandemic and to recover from the things that we have suffered, we will really need to have social infrastructure working for us. And you mentioned libraries. I'll wrap up by saying that, in the book, I'm specifically mainly concerned about the fate of public goods and public gathering places. So libraries and parks and schools that can be used by the community, athletic fields, beaches, places that have the capacity to bring us together, but also are part of the public domain. So we as citizens in democratic societies can shape the way we invest in them and how they're maintained. But I want to acknowledge that there are also private places that are part of the social infrastructure. So for instance, I'm guessing that the pub is an institution that matters to some of you, or the coffee shop or the restaurant. In the United States, we have the diner and the bar. And those places obviously are crucial gathering sites for communities. And, when the pub disappears, it can make a real impact on your life and community possibility for being together as well. The very last thing I want to say, because I'm excited for the conversation today, is that my argument in the book is not, if we just build libraries and parks, we're going to get over all the kinds of divisions that we face in the world today. I'm a bit of a realist, having spent the last 4 years in Trump's America, seeing the extent of our polarization, and I've spent enough time in England to know that we're not the only ones divided in the world. So my view is not that if we just build parks and libraries and social infrastructure, we're going to get over everything. But my view is that if we want to start to rebuild some sense of common purpose, if we want to establish some kind of connection and solidarity, we're not going to do it on Twitter. And the park or the library or the commons is the best place for us to begin. So thank you for having me here. I'm excited about the conversation.
Thanks very much, Eric. There's already a lot I want to follow up. And for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to read the book, I do commend it. But first, let me turn to Julia and ask you about what you see in terms of the post-pandemic landscape, Julia, and the scale of the challenge ahead of us.
Thank you. Well, Eric started us off at the beginning of this horrific period, which I think we need to give due weight to what's happened to the whole world in this year, and the damage that's been caused, which is, depending who you're talking to, the same as a world war or some major catastrophe. We need to recognise it for what it is. It's been dramatically changing. It's been a pivot point, not just an interruption in the road. And I think we've learned a number of things in the UK, which we should have known before, but we've been reminded yet again. We've learned about the power of sentiment and mood and emotion. I remember lots of people talking about it in the global financial crisis, that so much of what happened then was actually about sentiment and mood and emotion, and it's happened again. So we have gone through all the experiences that people report in natural disasters, the rush of adrenaline to begin with, the flourishing of mutual aid and support, the demoralisation, the exhaustion, and now the long slog through to some notional notion of recovery. But it's also done other things. It's accelerated some of the changes that were happening anyway. Our dilapidated high streets were heading that way, and now they look very empty indeed. And it's been, to use the old cliche, an X-ray on our society. It has shown some of the deepest divisions that the inquiry I led talked about 3 years ago. Divisions between what's happening in towns and cities and the experience of living in a town as opposed to a city. Divisions generationally, divisions ethnically, divisions in between parts of the country. But those two things together really matter. The notion that our recovery will require a sense of confidence and emotional ability and a sense of positive thinking is part of the other side of that story of deep division. Because the other thing it's shown us is the weakness of so many of our structures and systems. Right at the beginning of the pandemic in the UK, there was an explosion of social solidarity. There was a movement of people registering how important the local was. But there was also a recognition of how thin all our structures were. We've lost household name charities, major organisations that we thought were part of the fabric of our society, locally, as you're describing, Eric, or nationally, have lost a third of their staff in this year. We've recognised that services that run absolutely at full capacity will never be resilient. And we've learned that from the NHS, but we've also learned it from our great artistic institutions. And my contention is, if we're going to recover economically, we'll never do that unless we recover socially. And to do that requires building of confidence, a sense of value, a sense that what places look like matter, that our dilapidated high streets, our very miserable community centres, our closed and shuttered churches, our pubs and cafes, which when they were open were increasingly targeting very particular demographics and no longer a place for social mixing, are all part of the recovery. And that if we just see the return of the high street as reopening some of the shops that were already going out, which they're already closing before this started, we're missing the point. We're missing the point about how people care about their environment, care about the place they live in, and need a sense of pride and identity. And I'm with Eric thinking that libraries matter, institutions matter, but so does the state of the public realm, so does the shabbiness of our parks, so does our city centres affect how people feel about place and how they then feel confident enough to be entrepreneurial, to apply for jobs, to start businesses, to do the things that our economic recovery will surely require. So I don't think we will have that economic recovery without real serious attention to our social infrastructure. And that means treating our childcare and our libraries and our community centres as important as our broadband and new roads and trains. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And again, a lot I would want to pick up with you afterwards in the conversation. But let me turn now to our third speaker, Stephen Aldridge. And Stephen, if you can turn your camera back on, that would be fantastic. Thank you. It's the year when I've thought, I've not envied people in government coping with what's been happening. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about what it's been like and the extent to which this concept of social infrastructure will resonate with policymakers.
Yeah, of course. I think most definitely the concept of social infrastructure resonates, and I wanted to pick up briefly a bit about what we mean by social infrastructure, where I may have a bit of a different view, and why it's important. I think we've heard a bit about this already, but there's sort of two perhaps definitions of social infrastructure, one more narrow and one broader. I suppose ultimately my view is which one is right or which one matters ought to depend on what the evidence shows are the most important dimensions of social infrastructure in terms of delivering the economic and social outcomes we want. The narrow definition, as we've heard, focuses on physical spaces and places where people can meet, community organisations, and perhaps the connectivity, whether virtual or through local transport services, that enables people to meet and brings people together. The broader definition of social infrastructure would include, in my view, local public services of various kinds, and I would include within that things like early years services for children, or support for parents, youth services, mental health services, and so on. However, exactly defined though, I think social infrastructure does matter. It supports greater prosperity, both by enabling individuals and their families to access and take up opportunities, but also by supporting the creation of stronger communities. But how important is social infrastructure relative to the other drivers of prosperity and well-being? You know, in the economic literature, one will read that human capital, innovation, competitive markets, entrepreneurship, physical infrastructure, and more are all important drivers of living standards and prosperity. But we also have, I think, increasingly good evidence that social infrastructure can offer good economic and social returns too. That doesn't mean social infrastructure is a silver bullet for driving prosperity, but it does suggest it has a key role to play. And the returns to social infrastructure investment may be comparable to, or even better in some cases, than investments in physical infrastructure. Wanted to pick up on Eric's point about the emphasis on physical places and place-centric views. That's important, but I would suggest that perhaps one of the arguments for taking a broader definition of social infrastructure is that people matter as well as places. And social infrastructure may be very important in providing a bridge between the benefits of physical infrastructure investment and enabling perhaps the less advantaged to take advantage and benefit from those sorts of investment too. Social infrastructure is also important for our well-being. I mean, Richard Layard has set out the main influences on our happiness and well-being are our physical and mental health and our human relationships, which surely social infrastructure underpins. So 3 conclusions: recognise the importance of social infrastructure as a driver of prosperity and well-being alongside other key drivers. Building social infrastructure has implications for public policy and public services, and as COVID-19 has shown, communities and civil society matter for that. And last but not least, I suppose one must say, more research is needed to help us pin down which particular aspects or types of social infrastructure work best in delivering the outcomes we seek.
Thank you, Stephen. I want to pick up, first of all, with you and with Eric, this definition and measurement question, because I'm an economist and I always want to measure things. So I guess the question is, what can we measure in this, in terms of social infrastructure? What do we know, if anything, about which types matter more for people's economic or social or well-being outcomes?
Thank you for that question, and it goes also to Stephen's question about the definition. And I think it's important to kind of work this out to the best that we can at first. So the reason that I have a more kind of place-specific definition of social infrastructure and kind of refuse to take on so many things into the definition is I found that in the literature before I wrote my book, that social infrastructure was meant to refer to so many different kinds of things, activities, institutions, programs, that it couldn't really be contained and analyzed seriously. And so it seemed to me that if we were going to make it a more useful concept for research and also policymaking, it made sense to try to narrow it a little bit more. And I think there's some good kind of intellectual grounds for it as well. So for instance, I distinguish between social infrastructure that has physical places and kind of digital or virtual spaces, which people are quite enamored of today. I think of those things that, like, social media is part of communications infrastructure, but not social infrastructure. Even though a lot of social things happen there, there's something fundamentally different about the kinds of relationships that happen face to face over time. And it's my sense that relationships that exist online only and never get kind of consummated in physical life have just a different character. So I want to be clear, I'm not dismissing the significance of all of the important institutions and programs that Stephen's talking about, nor am I dismissing the importance of places like Zoom, where we all are here today, for getting us through a pandemic. It's just that I'm talking in my book about something different. So I think we're all probably interested in the same set of things. There's just conceptual differences. On the measurement issue, this is where I confess that I could use some help and things get tricky. So the way that my book works is that every chapter deals with a different kind of issue or theme. So there's a chapter on health, and a chapter on crime, and a chapter on education, and a chapter on climate, and one on kind of social connections. And Diane, in every chapter of the book, I try to kind of share the best evidence that we have, from my work and others, for how social infrastructure works and when it doesn't work. And so, I hate to say that the answer's in the book, but it's there. But the problem, the challenge is, and Dan, I think you'll really be able to appreciate this, is that if you're trying to create something like an index for social infrastructure, and you want to understand, if you have X dollars, then how many libraries do you want to build? How many parks do you want to build? How many playgrounds do you want to build? What gives you the most bang for your buck, as we say crassly in the United States? The problem is that it's very hard to assess the relative weight of different kinds of social infrastructure against each other. So partly it's because, in my neighborhood, for instance, we have Central Park in New York, and then there's a bunch of smaller parks, which on the conventional statistical analyses of parks all count as one park. But of course, they're very different kinds of parks. Or if you think about, the British Library compared to, the neighborhood library in a town, those are different kinds of things. And then I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s and 1980s. And like I said, in Chicago, we had a lot of public institutions that would have been great for social infrastructure, but they'd totally fallen apart. And so, how do you measure one that's really well maintained and programmed versus a piece of social infrastructure, that's disgusting and everyone avoids? And I have not been able to crack the puzzle of how to create the kinds of policy reports that people sitting in Parliament tend to want. That said, I think that a lot of social scientists and scholars underappreciate the power of more qualitative work that's descriptive and kind of strong arguments and stories for shaping policy. You'd have a hard time convincing me, for instance, that American social policy in the last 10 years has been based on the best quantitative evidence of what works and what doesn't. And so I think that we should be, bold about sharing the best evidence that we're able to get.
I think it's worth dwelling on this question of definition and measurement. Stephen, what counts as persuasive evidence on this front?
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, I would say I totally agree. It's not easy, and what we have is not perfect. But you can look at areas where, over time, we've been able to improve measurement and improve our understanding. So, for example, I think of the progress that's been made in understanding the drivers of well-being and the contribution of different factors to that. That evidence didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. Second thing I would note, but I just want to sort of contextualize it, that one of the things that worries me a bit about focusing too much on place and physical infrastructure is based partly on some of my experience in the past with some regeneration policies. There's a danger that you won't reach the people that you want to benefit. So this point about social infrastructure being a bridge that enables them to benefit from other types of investment is quite important to me. I also know, though it's partial, it's not complete, that from evaluation of different programs my department has done, that investments in social infrastructure, broadly defined, can deliver good returns, and as good or better than returns you might get ex post from, say, physical infrastructure investments. And I give the example, for example, of our integration areas program that sought to create a stronger sense of social cohesion and higher levels of social trust by improving community relations and connecting communities, or our evaluation of community-based English language teaching for those for whom levels of functional English proficiency are quite poor. We found evidence that does make a difference to inclusion and to their ability to gain employment, for example. And if you count it as part of social infrastructure, our Troubled Families program, which supports families with multiple and complex needs, has also demonstrated very good ex post returns. So that leads me to think that social infrastructure does matter alongside physical infrastructure, and may actually enable the people one might want to benefit from those social infrastructure investments to benefit from other types of investments, such as the improvements to the high streets or other things that, for example, Julia has mentioned.
I was going to pick up on that high street point and ask you, Julia, what kind of evidence do you look for to know whether social infrastructure is getting better or worse? And also perhaps you can respond to Eric's point about different quality of social infrastructure in different places, how place specific this is.
Well, we've had a big counterfactual, haven't we, this year? I mean, there was so much talk about the digital environment replacing that face-to-face activity, and actually we've experimented with it for a year, and we've muddled through in some ways. We've carried on having webinars and boards have carried on meeting, but it's not been adequate. And there's very strong evidence that we're not making the best possible decisions because of the ways we're meeting. So I think we've learned quite a lot in this year. In the teaching I think we've got quite an evidence base. I think the What Works Centre for Wellbeing has demonstrated really clearly, in England at least, the power of place. And I'm with Eric about the place mattering. What I'm not sure about is whether it is the large-scale capital that we need to improve our places. Because with Stephen, I have seen so much physical infrastructure just gentrifying an area and displacing people rather than changing what happens there. So I'm interested in how do we have social infrastructure that's intelligent, that's really in the control of people who live in an area, and which enables people to have that face-to-face contact and contact across generations. I can't say strongly enough how when I was leading the inquiry into civil society, everywhere we went, people talked about their pride in their place, even if they thought it was rubbish. So people's huge passion for their place, which I think policymakers, and I've been one a lot of my life, have just been rather illiterate about. Their pride in their place, the defence of their place, and the fear that too many of our new, more commercial institutions were just dividing and dividing people further and further. So, example, the cafes and pubs that Eric talked about are generationally divided, they're ethnically divided, and they're divided in terms of income and wealth. They are not what we used to have. And that's mourned by people because they recognise that we need those. You need to reach across divisions if we're going to get to the sort of recovery we want. And that's why I talk about a new vision for the high street, because I don't think it would just be encouraging the same tired old brands that have gone out of business to come back. I think what the pandemic's done is shown some things that were not sustainable, were not going to last. We need something new and different, but it does need to be owned locally. It's not just a big glossy building.
A really interesting point about local identity and place. To what extent, Julia, is it about values, cultures, communities, traditions, that all of those soft features that economists like me tend to run away from?
Really do, because you're always writing about them. Because I think that we will come out of this pandemic needing confidence and certainty and a sense of pride. And I don't think we get that by talking about being world-beating. I think we get it through our arts and culture and storytelling and how we mourn and grieve the bad stuff that's happened, but also how we celebrate a different sort of future. And I think that does need artistic organisations, it needs interest in our heritage, it needs a new approach to how people define and describe the place they live. And people need to feel some control over that. Fear is it's taken away from them, and then they don't have that sense of pride, which we absolutely know in our bones is what makes a place have the confidence it needs to be economically successful.
You know, I'm reminded by what you're saying of the debate that we had in the United States when a number of people on the right during the pandemic said, you know, we had to choose between protecting ourselves against the coronavirus and supporting the economy. Like it was a one or the other, and we couldn't afford to take the coronavirus seriously and to take the precautions that scientists advise because we had to stay focused on the economy, as if those things were not wrapped up in one another at the core. And if we try to build back in the absence of an open and accessible and welcoming social infrastructure, a commons, a high street, gathering places, I just don't see how we build the sense of solidarity and commitment to a shared project that society making requires. Because moving forward, we're going to have to figure out how to do things like share spaces and share institutions and share collective resources and allocate them in some ways that feels just and reasonable, or this whole democratic experiment collapses. And I wish we were not at such a fundamental kind of primitive moment in our development as democracies and societies, but we have fundamental work ahead of us. And I think it's for that reason that figuring out how to make our foundational places work better is so crucial. And in my view, there is no revitalizing the economy in the absence of a revitalized public sphere.
Indeed. We had the same division here about whether you wanted to end the pandemic or whether you wanted the economy to survive. And it completely ignores the biggest class division that was exposed in the UK, and I guess in the United States, which was the division between those who worked from home and those who couldn't. So actually, with or without lockdown, people who were in privileged positions protected themselves and carried on working.
That's a great point.
And other people brought stuff to us. So, we weren't all in lockdown. Poorer people carried on working outside the home and carried on taking risk. And we've got to repay that in a way which requires a different sort of settlement, I think.
So in the UK, we have this debate about this term levelling up, a debate about how to do that. And many countries have now great spatial inequalities in terms of people's incomes and opportunities and life chances. I'm going to start with Stephen, but then would like all of you to comment on the extent to which you think this is part of the political conversation or the policy conversation. Is there enough focus on the role of social infrastructure in levelling up? Can I turn to you first, Stephen?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think just a few things to say. First of all is, successive governments in this country have tried to address geographical disparities for perhaps approaching 100 years, which suggests that this is going to be quite a challenge, and we should recognise that. I think that's quite important. I also think if one's talking about geographical disparities, we need to be alert to the disparities that exist within regions as well as those between them. In terms of what works in dealing with geographical disparities, I don't think there's a sort of a magic bullet. I think we need a holistic approach. And it's for that reason that I think social infrastructure is important and does have a role to play, and that's supported by the evidence that we do have on the returns that it can offer. I think if you look at the emerging sort of suite of interventions, and it's in some respects still quite early days, there is a mix of emphasis on physical infrastructure, but also varying kinds of social infrastructure as well. And I think that will become clearer as, for example, plans for the Levelling Up Fund, plans for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and other things become clearer. I think, as you say, Diane, I think maybe we all find it a bit harder to get our mind around some of these softer aspects of social infrastructure. But I do think that fundamentally people realise these are important, and that will be part of the levelling up agenda.
Julia, same question to you. Do you think it's taken sufficiently seriously in the policy world?
I think it's been around for as long as any of us on this call can remember, and we just called it something different all the time. But I think what this crisis has shown is the deep damage that's done by failing to intervene and failing to make a difference. And we've also got very used to state intervention in a way that I think we'd forgotten that it could do. So this is a moment in time which is different from anything else, and the right time to do it. I'm absolutely with Stephen. If we treat this as a regional issue, we're missing the point. The point is that in particular parts of this country, where you are born affects your life chances more profoundly than anything else. If you're born in one of the coastal towns around England, you are likely to do much less well than if you're born in one of the big cities. And we need to recognise that, and recognise that's an enormous waste of capability and contribution. But it doesn't just require us to help those people to leave those places, because we end up with some desolate places for which everybody who's got the ability to leave has gone. We need intervention in those places which allows people with skill and ability to stay and to thrive. And we've done that very poorly over the last 20, 30 years, despite all our best efforts.
How does it look across the Atlantic, Eric, where you've got a very different politics, but also a federal system?
So the context is different here. And one way it's different is that the concept of social infrastructure really does not exist in the United States in the policy field in the way that it does in most of Europe. And so here in the US, I have to do a lot of work explaining what I mean. And that might make it, that might be part of the reason why I have such a narrow vision of this compared to, the ideas that Stephen is advocating. We need to start from the basics here. That said, there is a quite robust conversation in the US about a major investment in infrastructure. If you visited the United States recently, you'll know that, when you land in New York City, for instance, you quickly go back to the 19th century. Our roads are in trouble. I don't know if you followed the story of what's happened in Texas in the last couple of weeks when they had a very cold storm and, millions of people lost power, lost heat, lost water, their pipes froze, people died. I mean, every few months we have a historic crisis where the infrastructure breaks down. And in my work, I actually argue that social infrastructure can be a big part of physical infrastructure. And I try to push against some of the traditional distinctions. So for years, I was the research director on President Obama's Rebuild by Design competition, where he was using the federal government to try to generate innovative ideas for infrastructure development. And, what I tried to push the design teams and the policymakers to understand is if you're going to build, say, a flood protection system in a city or a town, let's say you want to build a seawall or, some kind of heavily engineered system. If you bear in mind that the thing you're building could have a kind of a double life of, working to prevent the flood, but also it could promote and sustain social life. Like a flood wall could be flattened out and turned into a bridged beam or berm. And on top of that berm, you can place a park or a bike path or a walking path. And so you can create a social amenity on what we once thought was only a physical infrastructure. And I think that's where the real opportunity for investment is moving forward, because we will spend trillions of dollars on infrastructure to get the US and the UK into the 21st century. And if we understand that every time we lift the shovel to begin a project, a public works project, we have a chance to also promote social life. And we design with that in mind, and not just with blocking out the water or getting a rail line in. We have tremendous possibility to do better.
A final question from me before we turn to the audience is about the best level of government at which to think about policies for social infrastructure. So following up on the thought process that in the US, you've got state and local governments that are more powerful. Is this something best thought about locally or nationally? Julia, do you want to start?
Well, I'll go because Stephen will talk about the national, and I think we ignore the local at our peril. I think that the powers and capability of the local has been eroded like so many other things. And yet we know that's where people understand what's happening, have that deep connection. One of the things that really struck me in the pandemic was the extraordinary ability of local authorities who have been clobbered over the last 10 years to rise to the occasion, and how those that were well connected with what my loose definition of social infrastructure, with the networks of organisations and community groups, did so much better. And I think what we deliver locally is often ignored, and we nearly always get it wrong when we ignore it.
Yeah.
Stephen, would you agree?
Yes, I would. I suppose the way I come to this is that seems to me different communities face different challenges, and that means the required social infrastructure response may well differ from place to place too. And that, to me, points to the importance of local institutions and community-based organisations. So I don't think my department is taking an entirely sort of national view, but that doesn't mean there's no need for national policies and programmes. Picking up on something Eric was just saying about physical infrastructure investment in the US, clearly such major pieces of infrastructure need, at least from a UK perspective, a role for national government, but it may be local government that can then help work through how best to exploit that in terms of how it might be used to improve social infrastructure as well. And this links very much to my point about social infrastructure providing a bridge between major pieces of physical infrastructure investment and helping the people we want to reach. And since, again, in the UK context, it will be national government that will put in place the flows of funds to those areas that are in greatest need and which cannot fund these things themselves. Of course, there's a role for national government too. And central government needs to make sure that there's the right framework joining up across departments to do this. And it needs to make sure that there's the right collaborative arrangements in place between central and local government. So whilst I think it's very important that local institutions and community-based organisations have a role and lead, but that needs to be done within a national framework.
What are your views on this, Eric? I mean, presumably President Obama's initiative, well, it was obviously a federal one, but states are very powerful.
I have to admit that in the last few months, I've grown much more optimistic about federal programs in the United States than I was a few years ago. I mean, the catch in the United States has always been that the federal government has so much capacity to move resources that if you have kind of a federal budget program to build things, you can just do a lot more than you can do, certainly at the local level. And I think not everyone understands about the U.S., but clearly you do, Diane, is that the state governments have tremendous power when it comes to how to spend federal money, and state governments also have their own tax base. Cities are, where the action is, but they're just much more constrained in terms of what kind of resources they have. There's a few American cities that can do a lot, but for the most part, cities are dependent on state governments. So it's got to be some combination of those two things. I just think we have this kind of historic opportunity now. We are passing public works programs and public employment programs and fiscal stimulus programs at a level we never have before. We are outspending anything we've done in nearly 100 years, and there's obviously urgent need, right? With tens of millions of Americans out of jobs. And very little reason to believe that the private sector is going to do all that. So I think we will see unprecedented federal spending in the US in the coming years, and it's going to be very interesting to see how that gets funneled through states. and what kinds of projects we'll get from them. So we need a strong push on the social infrastructure point. We do not have this tradition of emphasizing its importance in this country. And I think doing it could be a game changer here.
Well, that's a very positive note. I want to turn now to audience questions because we have so many, and I'm going to try to group them actually, because we otherwise won't get through all the questions popping up. And there are 2 or 3 about rural areas, which we haven't talked about, and whether there are particular challenges in thinking about social infrastructure for rural areas. Do they have different needs? And a reference, Julia, to your point about the ability of people, the places where people can mingle together across generations or across social groups. Maybe if I can ask you to start on that, and then the others pick up.
I think we have a real disease, certainly in England, perhaps less in the rest of the UK, that we find it very hard in these discussions to embrace the rural as well as the urban at the same time. And yet anyone who's done any work about poverty and deprivation in rural areas and the generational divides therein knows it's a huge problem. I just was looking at some of the questions and answers, and there are brilliant examples of some rural areas that have gone against the trend and are maintaining a sense identity of place, of pride in where they are. But far too often we are leaching out of rural areas, replacing people who live there with extremely wealthy people and displacing any activity because of the low levels of economic work. So I would argue for not a romanticizing of rural areas, but a recognition of what they're really like now and how younger generations can be enabled to stay there. Work I did a few years ago on rural housing, it's an absolute crisis when young people can't stay in the same place. And as soon as that happens, you break those bonds between generations, which I think are so crucial.
Eric, would you agree that the needs are different in the rural areas?
They are different in part because, you know, I think in urban areas that are densely populated, you think a lot about walkability and accessibility, and rural areas, it's more about building and maintaining and programming, larger shared spaces. There's been a hollowing out of, the union halls and the community centers and the swimming pools and athletic, complexes that sustain the recreational and social activities of a lot of small towns in the United States. This kind of metaphor of the drained swimming pool looming very large. One of the issues we've seen across some American communities is that as the United States was kind of forced by law to become more spatially integrated by race, some communities to kind of defend the prestige of whiteness in the community, just abandon the public realm. They'd rather drain the swimming pool than share it with Black people. And I think, a lot of communities, wound up hurting themselves in the process. There's a great book about this by Heather McGee that's come out recently called The Sum of Us. And so I think investing in small towns in the United States means building these shared larger spaces, but it also means, dealing with, nativism and the kind of exclusionary politics that have made our lives so divisive here. And that's not easy. And this is where I think you have to be really glib and naive to think that if you just build a swimming pool, you're going to overcome the problems. There's a lot more work to do on the ground. Once you get people who are different bridged together, which is so often our lofty social goal, you face the reality that there are a lot of people who don't like each other and don't want to share space with each other, have contempt and distrust for one another. And so, in some ways, the programming here becomes as important as the development of the physical space. I write about libraries a lot because libraries have these magical people called librarians, who are public servants designed to kind of make those bridges. But then the question for other communities is, do we have other people who could serve that function? And is that a way that we could get people back to work again, on playgrounds, on football pitches, at swimming pools, in libraries and union halls and places like that? I think those are tougher questions in a way than the question of whether to build something, but they really are questions we have to face.
So I want to stay with you for the next question, Eric, because it's related in a way.
Yeah.
I'm a devotee of libraries. I spent half my childhood in the local library. But the question is from Ray Shostak, one of our research affiliates at the Bennett Institute, about school facilities. He says they're the most accessible public resource in many communities. The education policy reforms have decreased their use for anything other than schooling. So how do you rate schools compared to libraries, and what's their role in social infrastructure?
Yeah, this is a really important point. And, libraries are free for everyone, and they're open to everyone, and they have this incredible way of, respecting the dignity of every person who walks in. It's part of their mission as institutions to kind of lift people up and to convey to them this kind of sense of respect that so few people get in the public realm. Schools are a different kind of creature. They have, historically been for, the children and their parents. Of course, in my country, things are slightly more complicated by the fact that everybody's got a gun. And so the schools are locked down and secured, and people are terrified of, outsiders coming in and doing damage. Fortunately, the rest of the sane world doesn't have to deal with that problem. But schools do. There are some restrictions as to what you can do with a school, given that children's well-being is involved. That said, there has been a very big push, even in the United States, to try to reimagine the public spaces in and around schools, the schoolyards, the playgrounds, the fields, in some cases, the school facilities as well, like the theaters and the gyms, so that they could be more accessible to the community when the school closes. And I think that it's a brilliant idea to repurpose these public institutions in that way. And, obviously in the American context, we have to think extra hard about how to do it safely. But it's an area for real thought and development. And I hope your institute can push forward with that idea.
Stephen, let me turn to you on the same question and ask you about the extent to which policy making in education about schools is or is not joined up with your thinking about social infrastructure.
Yeah, I suppose I don't feel particularly well qualified to comment on that, but I know my department works very, very hard to coordinate its efforts with other departments, and that's certainly the case in relation to the new levelling up and other funds. I suppose the point I just wanted to pick up on was these questions around libraries and high streets and what happens to them. I mean, the dismal scientist in me, the economist in me, sort of thinks, well, maybe change is inevitable, and there may be some benefits here from some creative destruction. And it may be that we need not just to think about halting the closure of libraries, but what sort of institutions or what sort of libraries do we want in future? In other words, what does tomorrow's social infrastructure look like, and how do we get to that? It also relates to a question that often goes through my mind when we're working on some of these levelling up or other initiatives. To what extent can we turn places round, or can we level up everywhere or not? What is the respective role of helping places and helping people, perhaps helping people to move elsewhere, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but what is the right balance? And certainly in the UK over the 10, 15 years, maybe longer, we've enjoyed the greatest rise in living standards are those who've been both occupationally and geographically more mobile. Now, you may say, well, that's not inevitable, but it does suggest we need to think carefully about what it is we can achieve where and what benefit that will have. I'm not saying I don't claim to have the answers, but I often worry or think about these issues when I'm working on this topic.
Thank you. So Julia, feel free to respond either on that directly or on schools, but I also want to park another question with you. It's from Liz Hughes at the Cambridge Junction, which is the arts centre up the road from me here, who says they're planning for recovery. What do you think local communities might need? And I suppose a follow-up is, how should we find out?
Well, yes, that's a very brilliant cue. I don't want to start on the schools thing, because it occurs to me, as always occurred to me, there are so many places that are theoretically shared and public spaces in which actually none of us, or very few of us, are allowed to go. And again, the pandemic has heightened that. We can't go to hospitals, we can't go to care homes, and schools, with or without guns, Eric, have become very protected places. So, you know, for as long as I can remember, there's been an issue about that bit of the public estate and who is there. We've known for a long time that associational life needs places. And associational life is absolutely central to our well-being. We don't survive unless we are in contact with fellow humans and are able to do things. And that might be singing in a choir, an allotment society, or volunteering. But for that to go anything more than just who you bump into, you need design to help that happen. And that means places that are open, that are shared, that are places you visit regularly and easily. And I'm more and more conscious, certainly in England, of how many barriers are put up around places. So we have fewer and fewer places we can meet, which does take me to the Cambridge Junction question, because I think one of the places that is being eroded is in the explosion of arts and heritage and festivals that was taking place before the pandemic and could start again. I live in the north of England, and the Hull City of Culture was laughed at as an idea and was transformative for the place, because people came together and felt a sense of pride in a city that has too long been dismissed. And it seems to me, and I haven't visited since because we're not allowed to travel at the moment, it seems to me that it changed things about the possibilities of that place. And so I do think arts and culture in its broader sense, involving people and asking them to help determine it, is part of our recovery as much as the creation of jobs, which we undoubtedly need.
The next question, I'm going to come to you first again, Julia. It's about the role of civil society. And as somebody who thinks about policy, I always think about what government should do. What's the role of civil society alongside government? And how is that affected by polarization that we have observed in society in recent years?
Well, I'd start by saying that civil society has to have a life regardless of government. The government creates the conditions in which you can have a healthy, vibrant civil society. But my contention will be, for too long we've looked to government for permission, and actually healthier civil society happens around all of us, and it is about how we associate, how we do the things we care about, how we make them involved with our neighbours, how we protest, it's how we want change, it's how we say things aren't good enough. And all of that requires an environment which enables and allows, but doesn't try and control and corral. And I don't think we've always got it right. I think the closeness of government to civil society, both locally and nationally, hasn't always been in the best interests of civil society, which needs to be able to express itself in a non-partisan, independent way. And will often be, as people keep telling me, pretty uncivil. People join civil society organisations because they're angry about things, they want to make change happen. And those are really precious voices. Without it, we are in deep trouble. So yes, government has got a role, but it's an enabling and an allowing role, and increasingly a funding role. But it's also a role of respect and what I've described as esteem. One of the phrases that when I was leading the inquiry we kept coming up against was people talking about the usual suspects or the busybodies in this neighbourhood. Those are the people we rely on to make our communities work. And yet it's become easy to be dismissive about activism, easy to dismiss people who want to make change happen. And I think that's deeply worrying if we care about a more united society in the longer run. And I think for economic recovery, we absolutely need to.
So Eric, let me turn to you on the same question. And, you know, I guess that sense of polarization is strong in the US as well. And a lot of people listening in will be familiar with the bowling alone trope. What's your view?
Well, you know, I think we have to distinguish between the polarization and the atomization. They are different things. And, you know, it's interesting, the US version of my book, the subtitle is How to Fight Inequality, Polarization, and the Decline of Civic Life. Well, we just had 175 million people, a record number of votes in our election. 81 million voted for Joe Biden. We saw kind of an activation of civil society and the kind of civic sphere in a way that I think few people expected. If there was a bright side to this existential threat against democracy and reason that we've lived through, it's that many people who took democracy and reason for granted realize that they have to defend it and fight for it. And so the trees have been shaken here. I'm less concerned about bowling alone, to be honest, and I am more concerned that we'll be hurling bowling balls at each other in canon. And so, I think the concern for me is that we operate with just about total contempt for people who disagree with us in the political sphere. And I don't know quite what to make of the fact that so many prominent American political officials, including the president, tried to throw out the votes of 81 million people. And I don't know, what we can make of the fact that the president and many of the leading national political figures on the right incited a violent insurrection on the Capitol, and that weeks later, the Republicans in the Senate decided that that was not worthy of impeachment and conviction. And so, for me, this language of social isolation and loneliness, it captures a certain part of the reality of life, in 21st century digital capitalism when we're all tethered to our screens. But social isolation and loneliness, they also capture elements of life in the late 19th and early 20th century when we were, becoming more industrial and more urban and more modern and moving out of the villages and into towns. And so I've thought for some time that we focus maybe too much on our anxiety of isolation, which, by the way, is not all that well borne out by the best data on how we socialize. And we've not focused quite enough on the very specific dynamics and challenges we face today. So for me, the issue is less isolation. It's less the decline of civic life now. It's more the decline of civility in the way that I think Julia just described it, of kind of the threat to a sphere for democratic life in which we can challenge each other and debate one another and disagree and have those battles without then calling in the troops to overthrow the government when we lose. There's a scorched earth nature to dissent that concerns me right now.
I think in post-Brexit Britain, some of that will be familiar. Stephen, on this question of civic life versus civility, where are you?
Yeah, I suppose I was going to just add that I think there is a very important role for civil society. And I think maybe part of the role of civil society is provide the sort of the bridging social capital that perhaps is the answer to what Eric was just talking about. But also historically, civil society has been very good at innovating and being creative, and many of the social policies that we've subsequently applied have actually originated from innovations of civil society. And against the backdrop of my worry that we need to be thinking about what are the characteristics of tomorrow's social infrastructure rather than preserving today's, maybe civil society has a very important role in helping us work out what form that should take, and what should tomorrow's high streets, what should tomorrow's libraries look like and do, rather than seeking to preserve the ones we've got now. But how exactly you nurture that, I'm not so sure, but I do think it's very, very important.
But we do know, don't we, that Eric was talking about the turn of the century and industrial revolutions and moving to cities. Every wave of big social change creates the next wave of civil society activity. we had a huge explosion in the 19th century in the UK of new types of organisations. We did it again between the wars and in post-war settlement. So this may be another moment like that, but I'm completely with Stephen. We have to be encouraging people, enabling people to think, what would we need next, rather than being, as I said before, about the rural, nostalgic about something that doesn't exist anymore.
There's a question here that's a natural follow-on about the role of local media. And I think, some of us have perhaps been concerned about the role of national media in polarizing debate. What's the role of local media? Should we be concerned about its weakness over time?
I mean, in 2007, I wrote a book called Fighting for Air, which was about the demise of local media and how much that matters for democracy. Especially, in the United States, given the extent to which state governments matter. And in 2007, when I wrote the book of warning everyone looks like the golden age compared to where we are right now with local media. I mean, the journalism sector has been eviscerated, and we just have fewer eyes on the street, fewer watchdogs. And I think we've seen in place after place, kind of local coverage of issues like what's going on with the tax base and what's happening with schools and the plans for libraries or the plans for gentrification and development, instead of that kind of stuff, which was, the blood of local journalism, the lifeblood of local journalism for a long time. We just have wire copy stories that come from, big agencies at the national level. And we have lots and lots and lots of opinion. And we live in a world where, opinion flows like water. And I think it's for that reason that it's become so much easier for people to challenge facts and to make up their own facts and know that very few people are going to be able to tell the difference. And so this, I think, it's not exactly social infrastructure, but while we're on the topic of democracy and civil society, I think this issue about the digital divide, the fact that so many people still don't have access to home internet connections and to the kind of core systems that they need to participate in society, and also the fact that around the world, with some exceptions, local journalism has been so imperiled. It requires a kind of public intervention that's different than what we've done before. I know there are a lot of interesting experiments about, how the public sector can support local journalism that I think are interesting. In the US, of course, we tend to do it much more with philanthropy, and there are a lot of philanthropic projects to do it. But we have market failure in both of those areas. Both getting the internet to everyone, given how much you require the internet to be a citizen and to have health and economic opportunities and educational opportunities in the 21st century. And we also clearly have market failure around the news.
Julia, would you like to?
Well, I think it's a very similar picture here because of the thinning out of any sense of local news, but also the betrayal of the promise that the internet brought, that we would somehow be able to have a plethora of different positions and news would be much broader and much more accessible. In fact, it's gone the other way. It's a very narrow offering in terms of print media and television. And in terms of news, it's very hard to get. And I think that feeds into the conspiracy theories and fake news, which are desperately worrying in the absence of really reliable, trusted voices. And I do think we're not telling the local story well enough because we haven't got a local press that we used to have in this country. And we haven't managed to replace it in the way we thought digitally we could.
So we've got on to politics and fake news. One of the things I've always thought about the local press is that it tells us about our own communities. Most people lead lives of habit, and it's the way that we used to find out about our places. And I, for one, was always thrilled when I featured in the local newspaper when I was growing up, which was rare, but always very exciting. I want to move us on to a question about what to do about all of this. In fact, there are 2 or 3 questions. One from a funder, Cassie Robinson. Lots of agreement on the value of social infrastructure but what should we do? What's the how? And so I think I'd like each of you to say what you think the most immediate practical steps would be to take in building social infrastructure. Let me start with Stephen.
It's a very good question. I suppose I think I'm tempted to say a much better synthesis of the evidence on the difference it can make. Because I often sort of argue for the importance of social investment. Sometimes struggle because I feel that the research base on which I'm drawing isn't as strong as I would like it to be. But I do think we're pushing at an open door, and if we can marshal the evidence and the arguments, that would make a great deal of difference.
Thank you, Stephen. Julia.
I think it's a brilliant question, and I'm very conscious this whole conversation we've been talking about what ought to happen without saying the how. I think there are moves afoot. I'm very interested in the community wealth building approach and the notion that holding some more assets at a more local level would strengthen people's confidence and ability to make decisions. But I also think we have hugely complex things to decide in every neighbourhood. And so making people skilled up for that sort of local negotiation, very taken by Eric's points about our inability to resolve difference. And we need to have an investment in how we do that. And I suspect that's to do with pushing power more locally. And that always means pushing some money and some resource locally too.
Thank you. Eric?
Well, as you could tell from before, I'm pretty bullish on the idea of taking advantage of the infrastructure spending that we're going to be doing in other parts of government and making sure that people who aren't social infrastructure people understand how social infrastructure could make their investments work better. And so I actually think there's a lot of kind of interagency cooperation that needs to happen within government. I think, one way to be politically successful in this area is, for people who understand the value of social infrastructure to see if it can get integrated into other spending programs. Because again, it seems to me it's inevitable. It's inevitable that we're going to make those other investments. And as Stephen says, there are a lot of open doors, ready for us to move through. So, by all means, really excellent evidence for efficacy will help. I say that with the caveat that it can be tricky to get exactly the kind of evidence that's some people want. But I think we have to try to make the case, and that means just being more entrepreneurial. My experience, actually, talking about things like libraries and parks and playgrounds, and commercial districts, high streets, is that with conservatives as well as progressives, the message resonates. People understand that we need these things. There are a lot of conservatives who really lament the loss of those gathering places and recognize how they mattered for their quality of life as well. We've had 40 or 50 years of a kind of ruthless neoliberalism, that has really hollowed out, many of our most sacred collective spaces, in the name of free markets. And I think we're now reckoning with the fact that did not serve us as well as some hoped. And in a way, the kind of hyper-individualism and distrust that has made it so much harder to respond to the pandemic suggests that we need a different way forward. So I apologize for being optimistic at this time of darkness and gloom. But I think that as scary as this moment is, and it's genuinely terrifying, there's also something exciting and exhilarating about it. I can't remember another moment in my life where so many things have been up for grabs, where so much seemed possible, where so many people were looking for another way to build. And I think those of us who understand how social infrastructure matters would be remiss if we weren't doing everything possible to make the case.
It's nice to hear the optimism. I'm going to stay with you, Eric, because there are a few questions that follow from your point about the nature of modern capitalism and the damage it's done. So one question is business and its profit seeking the problem? And another question from Esma about what's the role of business in being part of the solution? And I think that fits into a broader number of questions about how do we think about institutions, the interaction between physical, social infrastructure, physical conventional infrastructure and institutions. But do you want to say a bit more? You touched on this in your introduction too, Eric, a bit more about the role of business.
So there's different kinds of business, and there are businesses that are very much kind of in the business of bringing people together. They've been quite damaged by the last year. I think of all of the restaurant owners and pub owners, the people who, have retail shops. This sector has been devastated. The sector has helped to support and sustain so much of our face-to-face life, especially in places like the big cities, which are doing, relatively well compared to some other places. But I can't tell you what it feels like to walk the streets of New York City today, where so many places that sustained communities are shuttered and maybe not coming back. There's enormous amounts of jobs. So I think that we'd best be finding a way to support those industries and the people who work in them, because it will be much harder to come back if there's no place to sit down, and it's just, we need those spaces. Business also refers to the tech industry, and the tech industry is crushing it right now. They never have times been so rich and promising for the tech industry. And so, as all of us have gone home and hunkered down and come to snuggle up with our screens most hours of the day, we've paid a price in our social life, but we've also paid a price to these tech companies, which have, established a kind of record profits and moved into parts of the market they never thought they could get. And you would be pretty naive if you thought that when the pandemic ended, they were just going to let go of our eyeballs. They're here now to compete for our attention and allegiance, and to persuade us that life is better and more efficient if we're just home, doing the things that we used to do in person on our screens. And so, business, I think there's going to be a battle over this as we, enter into a post-pandemic period. And to be honest, I'm concerned about the lobbying power of the tech industry to push a different kind of economic and social development, one that does keep us more apart from each other than together. And, I want to hit this point one more time. One reason why I've been so insistent that I think it's more useful to think of social infrastructure as these physical places than the kind of virtual places is that, if I told you right now that I have news from New York that broke here that you're about to get, and it turns out that the pandemic is never going away, we're not. I could say. You're going to be able to make a living, but you're going to spend the rest of your life socially distanced, physically distanced. Well, we won't be in rooms together having the seminar. We'll be here on Zoom, from now on. It would be totally deflating and horrible. The prospect of sustaining this kind of lifestyle for a long time is miserable, because it will mean that we become something we don't want to be. And I think in some ways this year has put into relief just how valuable it is for us to be with each other, and how much we enjoy that kind of companionship. How diminished our lives are, our work time is. When we sit in front of our screen in a room with ourselves, interacting in this way. And so I think if we're going to come back, businesses will have to be part of it. The private sector has been a sustainer of social life since the early days of the souk, and it always will be. But business doesn't push us in one direction. There'll be a battle in the business world.
Julia, you were nodding there, and you touched on the local businesses in your opening comments too.
Well, businesses are not neutral, are they? They can be generative in the way that Eric's described, or they can be extractive in the way that we've experienced. And how we understand that and how we relate to them and how we recognize this fundamental human need to be connected to other people is incredibly important, because the digital promise has given us a notion of things that are deeply unresilient and not based on what humans need. Brought us all sorts of advantages too, but I'm absolutely with Eric. We need to be able to get out and get engaged with people and do things and use the digital tools that we now have for the things that make our lives easier, but not to replace that human contact, because that's what we've learned the hard way, is that we need it and we need to do it better. But to damn all businesses would be foolish, because it's clearly business is part of a recovering economy, and many businesses contribute to the social infrastructure as well. It's just they're not instead of, they're part of.
We have loads more questions, and I'm going to suggest that we write up a summary of the themes that have come out of all the questions today, but we're running out of time now. And I want to give each of you an opportunity for some brief final reflections on, well, whatever you like really, but the importance of social infrastructure, what we should be doing, how we should be thinking about the post-pandemic world. And let me go in reverse order. So start with Stephen.
Yeah, can I just, if I may, can I just pick up on some of the comments that Jess made? I'll be very brief. I just wanted to sort of note that I do think markets are very important. They're very powerful, and they've proved over centuries to be a very powerful driver of prosperity and living standards. So I think that's very important to bear in mind. Markets are also, though, a social institution. And social infrastructure, by building trust and can help markets work better. So these two things can actually go with the grain of each other, and I think that's something we should nurture. I also wanted to, if I may, tentatively defend the tech in the sense that even before COVID, at least in the UK, we were seeing progressive rise, for example, in online shopping. During the pandemic, we've seen remarkable advances in the use of online schooling, online healthcare, for example, and of course, I totally agree that there's nothing like real human interaction, and I'm confident that we will return to that. But at the same time, maybe this is another example of how the future will be different from the past, and we should relish that, seize the opportunities. I mean, I've just been astounded by how well, for example, the tech infrastructure has coped with the massive increases in demand. So there's a real positive story there too. But on the specific question of social infrastructure, I just wanted to reiterate my view that it matters alongside the other things we're doing, and events like this and research that helps us makes the case for it is to be greatly applauded.
Thank you, Stephen. Julia.
We always knew we were heading for a time of great disruption, didn't we? People were writing about there was going to be cyber attack or civil unrest, antibiotic resistance. There was going to be a big crisis, economic challenges of a major sort. And what we've had is a pandemic which has shown our strengths and our weaknesses. And I was Stephen, I can get very anti-digital, but I think you're right, it's brought us great benefits, but it's also exposed some of the things that are missing, which I would say are about the resilience of our institutions. It's shown we didn't have very much to give. We didn't have very much extra when it was needed. And actually we now have the empty streets that Eric was describing in New York, which are the same across the world. And we have people who I think have been emotionally and in all sorts of ways deeply damaged by what's happened. I don't think this is just an incident. I think this is one we will be living with for decades to come. We need to get ready for a very volatile world, but we've had an appalling shock, which should teach us some lessons about how we need to be ready and how running everything on empty and a doctrine of efficiency that says you have no fat in any system leaves us all pretty unresilient and pretty vulnerable.
Thanks, Julia. And Eric?
Well, I don't have last words that differ much from the words that came before. I do so appreciate you organizing the panel, and we tried to get a spark of disagreement, and unfortunately, the only thing we could disagree about is how you define things. What actually matters and what we want to do. I think we're all together on this. We live in a physical world, and it demands a kind of materialism that's different than the materialism that Marx pushed us to have years ago. It's kind of a bottom line materialism, but also attention to the things that matter, to matter itself, and the matter of the place we have in common, from the earth itself, which now has a salience to us as a vulnerable object that needs to be mended and healed, to the sidewalks and streets and parks and libraries and playgrounds that we depend on in our daily lives. And I do see an emergent politics around this matter. I think people understand it, and in a way, the loss of all of those things that we took for granted in this last year of our lives has made it all the more clear just how much we want them. And my sense is that when we hit a post-pandemic moment, when enough of us have been vaccinated and we get to herd immunity and it feels okay to go out into the public realm again, that there will be dancing in the streets, and that we will rush out to be with each other, and that people we would attack if we were seeing them as bubbles on a screen, we might well, high five face to face. We're not going to agree on everything, but it will just be nice to see even the people we disagree with again. And I think that, again, that there is something terrifying about this moment, and there's also something just completely exciting. I think the next several years are going to determine a lot of our future. And so what an amazing time to be alive and part of the fight.
So I'm going to take away from this conversation, which has been fantastic, your rousing optimism, Eric. I like that. A shared sense of the importance of social infrastructure, and something that's very pleasing to a researcher, a sense also that we need to understand much more, collect more evidence, research it, and get into the granularity of what it is that everybody, policymakers, civil society, businesses need to do about this. So we have come to the end today. I want to thank our speakers very much for a just fantastic conversation, and also you in the audience for joining us today and for great questions. Apologies again for not being able to get to really quite a lot of them, but we'll do our best to sum up the themes of the questions in a note as well. The recording of the event will be on our website and on our YouTube channel, so please catch up with that. Please also look out for the report coming out in April by Michael Kenny and Tom Kelsey about social infrastructure. And we have other great events and a newsletter for you to sign up to. All the information is in the chat and can be found on our website. The next event is Monday, the 29th of March in the Cambridge Festival. What does levelling up mean for Cambridge and the region? So please join us then too. But it remains only for me to thank you all very much, and hope to see you at our next event.